Hi, I'm Jeff. Boy, trees are nice, aren't they? I mean, look at them. They're gorgeous, they provide us with oxygen, and we can build all sorts of stuff out of them. But I've always wondered, how do we get something so big from something so small? And when does a seed become a tree? There's probably no debate more intractable than that of abortion in America. And it's really weird, right? Like, think of how much the conversation has changed on every topic over the last 20 years. Here in the internet age, with all the communication in the world, everything is different. Race, class, sex, gender. And yet, when it comes to abortion, nothing will break the impossible dichotomy of pro-life versus pro-choice. So let's take a crack at it, see if we can figure out why it's gotten this way, and see if we can think of a different way to talk about it. Now, to be completely upfront, I am biased. I am pro-choice, I always have been, but definitely my opinion has gotten a little more nuanced with time. When I was younger, I thought the debate was pretty stupid. I mean, people aren't people until they're born. That's why we celebrate birthdays. We could generously call that simplistic, but it actually is a thing. It's something anthropologists call biological birth, the moment when the baby leaves the mother's womb. But when we discuss abortion, what we're really talking about is something called social birth. The moment, or often moments, when society begins to treat an entity as an actual person with rights and feelings and whatever. Here in the US, it generally begins as soon as the mother learns that they're pregnant, but in plenty of societies they've had delayed social birth, sometimes weeks, even years after the child's been born. Which might seem crazy, but you have to ask yourself, is this a tree? The colonies imported their social birth from England with something known as the quickening. That magical moment when you first feel the baby kick. It's about 4 to 5 months in. It's the only way to know if you're pregnant, so before that, abortions couldn't really be considered a thing. You might go to an herbal healer or a midwife or another woman to get some kind of concoction to deal with your obstructed menses, and that was it. But even after quickening, abortions were only considered a misdemeanor, not a felony, and they were rarely ever prosecuted. I mean, how would you even prove a quickening took place? Only a mother would know what's happening in her own body. Oak trees drop acorns, which get eaten by little animals and then they get pooped out somewhere else. You can't plant them right underneath the oak tree, so it has to be that way. But it's an imperfect process, so oak trees have to produce a lot of acorns to make sure it happens. In a given year, a single oak tree could produce 10,000 acorns and still never produce a single tree. But throughout the 1800s, a big push was being made to industrialize the medical industry, to regulate practices and license doctors and nurses. The argument was that medical practices should be left to trained professionals, which sounds all well and good, but you have to remember, this is the 19th century, and medicine was considered more an art than a science. Part of the reason they were trying to regulate was they were trying to unify all these conflicting ideas for treatment. Among them were the belief that water has memory, the belief that all illness stems from misalignments in the spine, which is the pillar to the soul, and bloodletting to balance the four humors. Hell, viruses weren't even discovered until 1890, so most of these guys didn't even wash their hands before delivering a baby, something midwives have been doing for centuries. Now, that created a certain amount of ambition, but it didn't get us all the way there. But around the 1840s, there was an uptick in the number of abortions among wealthy white women. And this spawned a new fear. What would happen if all the poor and the foreign and the coloreds began to outbreed us wealthy white men? You might recognize this train of thought if you've ever had the pleasure of meeting a white supremacist, or a white nationalist, or whatever the cool racists are calling themselves these days, ethno-national turf butt smell boys. In response to this fear, as well as just the usual misogyny, a new narrative was formed. Abortion was unnatural. Or, more accurately, abortion was the denial of a woman's natural duty to others. Duty to God, to society, to children born and unborn. And when I say natural, I don't just mean it was a moral judgment. The claim was that abortion was such a shock to a woman's body that it could cause illness, insanity, even death. Which of course makes abortion a very serious health issue, and here we come back to those physicians and the newly formed American Medical Association, which was all too eager to lend credibility to their fears and to the claims of naturalness. Another way to say regulate the medical industry could very well be criminalize its competition, which is exactly what they did. The midwives and healers we talked about before, they were driven out of work, only to have many of their techniques verified by science-based medicine many years later. By the end of the century, pregnancy had been medicalized, and abortions were deemed illegal except were deemed necessary by a licensed physician, removing the agency of the mother and putting it in the hands of whatever brand of snake oil salesman they happened to call doctor. Tree nomenclature tells us that there's a number of stages in the tree growth cycle. There are seeds, then there are sprouts with a little thing sticking out of it, and then there's the seedling, which I haven't been able to find. They probably just look like bushes. It's when a tree first starts to pop out of the ground, and then they become saplings, which is arguably just a small tree. But it's important to keep in mind that from the tree's perspective, there's no difference really. It just grows. Very much like growing up from a baby to a kid to an adult. One day you just wake up and realize, oh, it already happened. For the first half of the 20th century, status is pretty much quo, and abortion largely goes unmentioned in the public. Then, in the 60s, some things change. The rise of second-wave feminism being the obvious one, and with it, new philosophical ideas about bodily autonomy and agency, illustrated excellently by the great Ollie Thorne here. I've actually never done this before, so I'm hoping that I figure this out later. It's here, maybe? There are other reasons for the change in attitude, though. The invention of birth control really changed the way we think about sex and its consequences. There was also a highly publicized rise in the rate of birth defects, both due to an outbreak of German measles and a notorious sleeping pill called thalidomide.
Hi, me from the future. I was going to jump into this big bit about thalidomide, but I'm starting to get a little uncomfortable with how much I'm basically just shitting on doctors this whole video. So I want to be clear that almost all this stuff happened way before modern day medicine as we know it. Which is not to say that modern medicine is infallible, but it's significantly better than like guessing and trusting our intuitions. So please, please trust in the vast majority of doctors and the scientific consensus when they say you should do things like vaccinate your kids and not put rocks up your vagina. Gwyneth. Though I did like her in Endgame. That last scene got to me. She's a good actress. Probably helps be crazy. What are we talking about?
Abortion.
Oh, right. Sorry, go ahead.
Actually, I was kind of enjoying taking a break.
I know. Just get through the history and then we'll go get a drink.
Joel, hey, can we skip Roe?
Roe v. Wade? Isn't that important? I feel like that's important.
Sure, but I'm not qualified to talk about this legal mumbo jumbo. It's something to do with privacy, which is not actually right. It's complicated, man.
Sure, but we could just try to... Wait, privacy's not a right?
No, but don't worry, it's implied by the 9th and 14th Amendments. I don't understand any of this.
Why would you just leave... lawyers. Fine, skip it.
So leading up to Roe, a number of states were legalizing abortion, and anti-abortion groups could see the writing on the wall, and they knew they had to change their strategy. So they came up with a new slogan, Right to Life, or pro-life, which was a brilliant political marketing tactic. They changed from being anti-something to being for something. And what are they for? They're for life. Oh, who isn't for life? We should all be pro-life, which is the other part that makes it brilliant, is that it implies the other side is somehow anti-life or pro-death. Pro-life was a massively successful change in tactic. So successful that abortion advocates had to change their label to pro-choice just to counteract that. And we're going to come back to that. The rest of this history you likely know or can at least guess. The Democrats through the 70s aligned themselves with feminists and therefore the pro-choice stance. The church gets involved in the pro-life stance, and in 1980, Ronald Reagan runs on a pro-life campaign, even though he was previously pro-choice, in order to garner votes from the church. This solidified Republicans as the pro-life party, and that's where we're at today. course, the last thing we have to talk about are groups like Operation Rescue, a pro-life group that used terror tactics to silence the other side. They got a media spectacle. There were death threats, kidnappings, and murders. There weren't that many of these people, but there's something we've really learned in the internet age, particularly from Gamergate, that we can apply here, that the use of terror tactics, even if used by the minority, creates a culture of fear that all members of the group enjoy the privilege of. They terrorized people, and it silenced us, and we don't talk about abortion anymore. Not really. Let's get that drink. Coniferous trees like this spruce here produce cones. You might be familiar with the female one, but there's actually a male cone as well. These little guys, they release pollen and then that gets into the female to open them up. But it doesn't just open up just because of the pollen, it has to have a lot of environmental factors too. Some release because there's a frost and then it dethaws, some because there's a fire and it opens it up that way. It's almost as if trees have some kind of plan for parenthood. Okay, so I initially recorded this next part in a bar, but it ended up sounding really terrible, and I've been working on this way too long. So I'm figuring sweatpants, raggedy sweater, bottle of wine. Let's do this.
So, what have we learned? Well, first of all, this is not a natural debate. Yeah, I'm just gonna keep going. There's this idea that people have that the abortion debate is part of just a larger debate of when seeds become trees, when human beings really come into existence. But that doesn't explain why the debate became the forefront of politics in the 1840s specifically. There's no new philosophy that's being written on the subject. There's no new scientific discovery to explain this. No, it's made explicitly clear that this is about a fear of being outbred by other classes and other races, and I swear to God, they didn't say foreigners, they said non-natives. Non-natives. I mean, I wasn't sure how much I wanted to swear in this thing, but if that doesn't pull a hearty what the fuck from the bottom of your bootstraps, I don't know what will. The fear kind of makes sense from their point of view. I mean, imagine you're a rich white guy in early America. It's this new idea of freedom that you've never really known, and the Industrial Revolution is coming, and there's all this lead up to the Civil War, and the world just feels so uncertain, you know? And uncertainty is where fear breeds. And fear
leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
You know, Phantom has its moments. The way physicians told women about their naturalness is really interesting. It's not just about telling, it's about the performance of the procedure. In his book, Articulating Life's Memory, communications professor Nathan Stormer argues that this is a form of anamnesis. It's the act of remembering some supposed previous time. You know, if you were trying to remember a time when your country used to be good. Not just good, but like better than good. This joke has been done to death, hasn't it? I'm gonna move on. But seriously, I said before it was about denying a woman's duty to others, but they wouldn't say that to the women, right? They'd go to them and say, oh, you've forgotten this important thing that your body is trying to tell you. I'm not usually a fan of the idea that science is a religion or whatever, but put people in a big building with somebody dressed as an authority figure who's speaking about things, it seems like they know what they're talking about, and they have an enormous influence on our culture. It's just something we ought to be aware of. Note that the religious aspect is largely absent from the conversation, which is pretty surprising. A lot of people think that the abortion debate is just a symptom of the religiosity of our country, but it seems like this is yet another example of religion being used to post hoc rationalize previously held beliefs. Wine's good. Speaking of motherhood, I really recommend this book, The Seed by Alexander Kimball. Infertility as a feminist issue really points out the way that we talk about motherhood is super, super hurtful to everyone involved. First of all, let's say you just want to be a mother. The idea in our culture is that it's going to be something you're going to get swept up in, that your biological clock's going to be ticking, that your hormones going to be pumping, and you just need to have a baby right now. Well, if you never feel that way, you might feel like you're broken. If you do feel that way, then that's not the way you start a family. Maybe you should have a plan, maybe? But then say you want to have a baby and it doesn't seem to be working out. That's really hurtful. That you feel like your body has somehow betrayed you, that you're somehow less of a woman. The anti-abortionists are basically saying, if you get pregnant, you must accept it. But they're also saying, if you can't get pregnant, as a woman, you can't accept it. To say nothing of how painful this must be for trans women when TERFs use the naturalness of motherhood as ammunition against them to say that they're not really women. Besides, the whole thing is just a naturalist fallacy. I mean, just because you have an axe doesn't mean you have to be a lumberjack. Also, it conveniently leaves men out of the child rearing conversation. I mean, no one's ever said anything about the naturalness of fatherhood to me. Like, seriously, I could go get a vasectomy tomorrow and no one will bat an eye. But a woman goes to get her tubes tied and then they gotta answer 40 questions about their future, like everyone's a goddamn high school guidance counselor. Reading about the 60s is always interesting. It feels so reminiscent of today, Like, we're fighting for a woman's bodily autonomy and agency, but we're also, like, fighting for the agency of our own culture. This is really cheap wine. I like it. But the big thing I want to really talk about is how pro-choice is just a terrible argument. Like, let's say you're pro-life and you believe that life begins at conception. So start to think about it as not a fetus and then a baby. Think of it as an unborn baby and then a newborn baby. The difference is location. They think these things are equivalent. And now someone comes to you and says, well, a mother has a right to choose. Choose what? Choose to murder children? You sound like a sociopath. This argument doesn't hold water. It doesn't get us anywhere. And it doesn't approach the problem the way it really needs to be approached, which is to say, pro-life, well, sure, we're all pro-life. But life was never the issue.
After all, trees are alive, and I wouldn't hesitate to knock that sucker down and make a piano.
The question of social birth was never about life. It was about personhood. When we treat a being like a real person with rights and feelings and whatever. The question of when does a seed become a tree is irrelevant, really. One is a bundle of cells and the other is a bigger bundle of cells on a giant rock floating through space. Nothing has intrinsic value, not even life. We ascribe it that value, and persons have value, not life. But persons have value because we value each other. And if I don't want to suffer and you don't want to suffer, then we probably should live by a code of principles that says, hey, let's not treat each other poorly. Maybe life will be just a little bit better. Now, I'm not going to suggest that I know the real definition of personhood. Better minds than me have tried, and probably all have failed. All I'm suggesting is we actually deal with the matter at hand and not let all these people just dictate what the question really is. If somebody says that they're pro-life, ask them what they eat. And if they say, well, I mean human life, then ask them what makes human life so intrinsically valuable. This is the real conversation we need to have, and we need to have it because not having it is not working. Not asking the right question has caused immeasurable damage to our society. So even if we can't think of an answer, at least ask the right question. Because so long as we ask the right question, we can create some parameters on where the answer might lie. And I think a good safe bet on when personhood begins would be when a mind exists. So when does cognitive function begin to develop in a fetal brain? So just looking this up real quick, let's see. Brains develop at 5 weeks, but I don't give a shit about brains because flies have brains and I'll swat those fuckers out of the air, no problem. So let's talk about, brain function really working and viability out of the womb and, really having thoughts. And, we seem to come to a good age of around 20 to 22 weeks. That seems like a good time. I think we can all agree. Let's just cut it off there. I have a bad habit of starting projects and then not finishing. And I'm working on this one for a while. I'm sure it doesn't show, but I've never made video before, so I had all these false starts and technical problems. It's kind of been a disaster. But I had to finish, because I've been telling people about this. And when I did, they always had this question. Why? Why this topic? Why video? Which is fair, but I didn't really have an answer. But then I read in Nathan Stormer's book, he says the abortion debate is a kind of metaphor for a more fundamental question of human being versus human becoming, which was pretty interesting to read because I had just been reading Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed. In it, the physicist Chevek is dealing with this question of sequency versus simultaneity. It's a physics problem, but it's a metaphor for the anarchist politics of the book. He says, becoming without being is meaningless, but being without becoming is a big bore. At some point, we have to treat a human being as having become a person. But just because we drew that line doesn't mean the conversation has to end there. We can keep doing better. This video is not very good, but I can do better. I learned a lot, so I'm gonna try and make another one. I don't know what about yet, but it was a lot of fun. Believe it or not, there are things I'm good at, but I've found in my life that being good is never as good as getting better. So I'll see you soon.